Let's see how we can set up project invoicing in AX. By the end of this course, you should be able to see how invoicing can be done on time and material contracts, how to set up invoice formats and print settings for your invoices, how we can invoice fixed price contracts based on milestones, progress, and unit of delivery, how we can invoice prepayments and reconcile prepayments against actual costs incurred on the project. Invoicing time and material contracts. I have a project contract, a time and material project contract here, and I have a funding limit associated with this. I have one funding source, which is active transport, and I have a funding limit associated with them of about $50,000 for our transactions for the consult labor category. So what this means is that active transport does not want to exceed $50,000 on management consulting category billings for them. So I have this set up on my project contract. Let's log a few labor transactions and notice the billing information that defaults onto those transactions based on the contract setup we have. In order to log transactions, navigate to the project that is associated to the contract. Here we are taking the approach of logging journals. Normally, you might log timesheets against a project. Consultants would be logging timesheets against a project. The defaulting mechanism is the same. So let's log our hour journal. Let's create an hour journal. Let's add some lines. Let's select the management consulting category. Let's log about 10 hours in this category. And notice that the line property has defaulted to being billable because we have the line property set up as billable for this category in our line property setup. And notice that the sales price has defaulted from the pricing setup that we have for this consult category. Notice two other fields that have defaulted from the contract setup. There is the sales tax group, which defaults from the contract. The second field relating to sales tax is the item sales tax group. The sales tax that defaults that gets applied on a transaction is a combination of sales tax group and item sales tax group. Sales tax group defaults on the transaction from the setup you have on the contract. Item sales tax group defaults from the setup you have on the category. On this consult category, I do not have any item sales tax group set up, so it has not defaulted. Let's go ahead and set up an item sales tax group for this consult category. So you would right-click View Details to navigate to the category setup. And here I have consult category, and these are the properties. Let me associate a sales tax group for this consult category. Now that we have associated, we will close it, and let's remove this transaction and add a transaction. Let's add the consult category and have 10 hours on it. And now you would notice that the item sales tax group has defaulted from the category setup that you have on the category. So we have the sales price that is defaulting based on the pricing setup for the category, and we also have sales tax and item sales tax defaulting from the category setup. Let's post this hour journal. In most professional service firms, invoices are usually edited before they are sent to customers. So the notion for Dynamics AX is that it creates an invoice proposal that can then be assigned for approval to the project manager or the account manager on that engagement. Let's go ahead. Since we have one chargeable transaction on this contract, let's navigate to the Maintain tab on the contract details page. Under the New button group, you will see a New Invoice Proposal button. Let's hit this button, and then this is the Create Invoice Proposal dialog. So here we are initiating the process of creating an invoice proposal. You can filter on this screen, you can select a funding source. When you have multiple funding sources on a project, on a contract, you can select, we have only one customer on this contract, so that's the default customer to which this invoice will get created. And you can filter transactions using any of these filter parameters here. You can change the filter parameters. If I uncheck hours and say search, my hour transaction does not show up for invoicing. If I select hours and hit search, the hour transaction shows up in my proposal dialog for creating invoices. So we can create an invoice proposal using these. And as you're aware, you can have multiple projects associated with a contract, and all those projects will show up here. On this contract, I only have one project, so that is the default project, and I only see transactions relating to that project. So I'll go ahead and create the invoice proposal. And this invoice proposal can then be further edited on your UI. You can change the sales price of the invoice. You can change the description of the transaction, or you can have some attachments that you would want your customer to see on this form. There is also functionality, the workflow functionality for invoice proposals, where you can assign this invoice proposal to be submitted in workflow for somebody in your company to approve it. Let's look at the workflow configuration for invoice proposals. Navigate to the area page, open the project management and accounting workflows, and here you would see I have defined a workflow configuration. Let's review that workflow configuration for invoice proposal. The workflow editor has opened, and here I can have, let's look at the toolbox of what is available. You can have an approval element. You can have a post task on your workflow configuration, and your approval element, you can always have a conditional workflow based approval or an auto approval for your workflow. And over here, if I said that I only want approval, manual approval for invoices that don't have any credit transactions, and I only want to send invoices that have credit transactions for approval. If I want something like that, I can go ahead and I have this field selector. I can go ahead and select the field of invoice method. And if the invoicing method is I'm sorry, that's not the field, but so if it's of type invoice, I always want it auto approved. So this is how I can set up an auto approval action for my invoice. Let's close this. And we see by default, workflow processing of invoice proposal is not turned on for projects in AX. Let's go ahead, turn that on, and see how we can turn that on. By default, invoice proposals can be posted outside of workflow. If you want to have workflow-based approval, go to the project management and accounting parameters form, navigate to the invoice section, and you can enable invoice proposals processing in workflow. Once you have this checked on, you will be able to see the workflow bar on your invoice proposals list page. Let's navigate to the invoice proposals list page, and as you can see, we now see the workflow bar on our list page, and we can submit invoice proposals to workflow using this workflow bar. But if you do not want workflow-based processing, you can turn that off, and you will no longer see the workflow bar, and you will be able to post invoices without approval. The bar is not there anymore, and you can actually post invoices in workflow. Let's review some of the concepts we have seen in this section. Line property governs the chargeability of a transaction, and in a time and material contract, line property setup can be used to specify which categories actually end up on the customer sent invoice and which do not. In the case of any ad hoc changes to the chargeability of a transaction, you will be able to post an adjustment to change the line property so that the transaction can show up on the invoice. Sales tax. The sales tax applied to a transaction is a combined result, as I have shown you, is a combined result of the sales tax group and the item sales tax group. Sales tax group is defaulted from the project contract, and item sales tax group is defaulted from the category setup. And every transaction has category and a contract associated to it. Therefore, AX can figure out the sales tax that is applicable to that transaction. We have looked at the invoice approval workflow, and as I said, we have the ability to define a dedicated workflow, and you can also define multiple workflow configurations for invoice approval process. If you have only one approval process, you only need one workflow configuration. If you need different workflow configurations based on certain parameters, you can set those up and define different workflow configurations. And workflow-based approvals are not mandatory. You can always turn off workflow-based processing of invoice proposals.